This is the 2022 Audi R8, and it has a big V10 with up to 600 horsepower for now. Audi says the next generation R8 is going electric, so the V10 will be gone, but it's available now, and today I'm going to review the updated 2022 model. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some fantastic sales recently, including this 997 Porsche 911, which sold for over $55,000, this fantastic Toyota Land Cruiser Heritage, which sold for over $100,000, and this old school Jeep Cherokee, which brought $24,000. These older Jeeps are getting more and more interest these days. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it, with daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. So let's talk R8. The Audi R8 has gone through a lot of changes since it first debuted in the late 2000s, and these days they all have V10 power. For 2022, you can choose between rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive and between a coupe or a convertible. This is a rear-wheel drive coupe, which means it has a starting price of around $150,000 and 560 horsepower. And today, I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the latest R8 and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the 2022 R8 with a quick overview of the lineup. Like I said, rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, coupe or convertible. So the cheapest model is the rear-wheel drive coupe. That's this car. Starts around $152,000. The lineup stretches all the way to the all-wheel drive convertible. They call it the Spider, which has a starting price of around $216,000. But anyway, let's talk about the V10, which, like I mentioned, is this car's only powertrain. There's no V8 R8 anymore. They all have a V10. And in the rear-wheel drive cars, it makes about 560 horsepower, or upgrade to all-wheel drive, and it makes about 600 horsepower. Serious figures for this car. Now, to get in and take a closer look at the V10, interestingly, there's no latch you pull like almost every other car. Instead, there's this little switch. Almost looks like a power window switch, but that controls the hood release in back. And the annoying part is it only works if the car is on. It has to be on and running. Not even just in accessories mode, the engine has to be turned on, meaning that if you've broken down and you really need to access your engine, well, your engine cover won't actually open, so you can do that to fix whatever is broken, which seems like terrible design, and it is. But anyway, with the car on, you can pop open the engine cover, get back here, and take a look at the V10. This is just plain cool. A naturally aspirated V10, a relic from a prior era, and the very last V10 powering production cars on sale today. This very same engine is also used in the Lamborghini Huracan, and it's the last V10 on the market. This is where it all ends. Now, Audi has already announced that the next generation R8 will be going fully electric, and rumors are that the next generation Huracan will have some sort of hybrid V8. So this really may be the end of the line for the V10, and it's a very cool swan song. Now, beyond the horsepower figures, which I mentioned earlier, it's important to point out rear-wheel drive models have 406 pound-feet of torque, whereas the all-wheel drive cars have 413 pound-feet, so a little upgrade for the all-wheel drive cars there. 0 to 60 is in the mid 3-second range, regardless whether you get rear or all-wheel drive, and rear-wheel drive shaves off a little weight, about 110 pounds lighter if you choose rear-wheel drive instead of all-wheel drive for your R8. But the all-wheel drive model does add some other benefits beyond extra power and, of course, all-wheel drive. It comes standard, for example, with carbon ceramic brakes and laser headlights and carbon fiber side blades and a few other upgrades. Now, you can add back pretty much all of this stuff to a rear-wheel drive R8 model and option it just like an all-wheel drive version. But the drawback then is, of course, cost. At that point, when you add everything back in, you have the same equipment as an all-wheel drive model, but you're only about $15,000 cheaper, and you're down about 40 horsepower and 2 drive wheels. But there are some people who insist the rear-wheel drive car is better, handles better, more pure and precise. precise and, of course, lighter. So they would actually prefer the rear-wheel drive car over the all-wheel drive version. But anyway, next we move inside the R8, and I'm going to start with the key, which is just a fairly standard Audi key, as you can see, with two notable changes. On the back it says R8, obviously, and on the front with the buttons, the trunk button is this one, an image showing an R8 with its front trunk open, as opposed to a normal Audi with its rear trunk or tailgate open, which is kind of a cool little piece of attention to detail. But anyway, climbing inside, you open up the door, and just like previous R8s, you have this weird two-window situation. You have the main window in the door that rolls down like a normal car window, but then there's sort of a rear part of the front window that stays put. Even though this hangs over the front door, it's like a rear window, and it doesn't roll down, and it's fixed in place, and it's kind of odd, like a back window for rear seats that don't exist. So a little bit of a weird touch that I guess came about because of the way the R8 is designed. But anyway, next you climb inside the R8, and the first thing you discover in here, the very unusual thing about this car is there's no center screen in the R8, no infotainment screen in the center like there is for pretty much every other car on sale today. Instead, the only screen in here is in the gauge cluster, and all functions are controlled through there. Now this means that the backup camera is in the gauge cluster, which is actually pretty useful. Right in front of the driver, it's easy to see, easy to look at, that makes sense. But the drawback, as you can imagine, is everything else is in there too, and that means radio controls, phone, navigation, it's all confined to the driver's line of sight. So in the center console, you have a set of controls here for the navigation system, the radio, the phone, all sorts of stuff you can control here from the center as the driver or the passenger. But if the passenger is controlling it, they'll have to look past the steering wheel and into the driver's gauge cluster in order to adjust any of that stuff. It's a big surprise and very different from how most other cars do it. And it would kind of get annoying if the passenger wants to do some of that stuff and they can't. The driver has to do it all, but that's kind of the point of the driver focus in the R8. And that driver focus continues in other places in here, specifically on the steering wheel. Now, for one thing, the driver has the ability to completely change that gauge cluster screen layout and view. With these buttons here on the steering wheel, the driver can adjust exactly what's being shown, all sorts of different configurable displays, including a full screen map with Google Maps showing exactly where you are, which can be tremendously helpful since it's almost exactly in your line of sight. I've said before that Audi has some of the very best gauge cluster screen configurability in the car industry, and that's still true here. It's fantastic, really easy to use, and you can make stuff larger or smaller depending on exactly what you want to see. It's a really, really great system, and it really works fantastically. But there is more driver focus on this steering wheel than just that. For example, your drive mode button is here. This little circle button on the steering wheel controls the drive mode instead of in the center console like in most cars. You also have a checkered flag button here next to the drive mode. You press that and the car enters a specific performance mode, which turns off stability control. It's like sport mode but on a next level, and that button is confined to the steering wheel as well. Now over on the other side you have your engine start stop button here, again on the steering wheel instead of the center console or the steering column like in a lot of cars. And you also have this button, which is of course for your sport exhaust system. Press that and it turns on the sport exhaust, and it sounds pretty good. Take a listen. Yes, that sport exhaust does sound good, but it's important to point out it is a $3,600 option in this car, so it's rather pricey for that sound, but it's probably worth it. Now, speaking of options, one interesting thing about this particular R8 is it's optioned with the carbon fiber interior package, but that doesn't include a whole lot of carbon fiber. You can see some here in the center console, which looks pretty cool, but other than that, carbon fiber is primarily confined to some trim around the air vents, as you can see, the center vent here and also the vents on the doors, and then also some trim on the dashboard and the gauge cluster area, but that's it. No massive carbon fiber treatment in here, no like steering wheel carbon fiber, there's no carbon fiber at all on the door panels, there's no carbon fiber on the seat backs like in some cars, so you do get this carbon fiber pack, but it's not that carbon fibery in here. Indeed, the carbon fiber interior package is pretty restrained, especially considering you're paying extra for it. And another thing that's kind of restrained is the badge over on the passenger side of the dashboard. It just says RWD with a massive line in front of it, like a big long underscore. No R8, no V10, just RWD. So you know that this is the rear-wheel drive model, I guess. But it's worth pointing out that that's not all that surprising, these restrained touches, because minimalism is kind of a theme in this car's interior. A good example of that is the climate controls, which are really simple. Just 3 dials and 3 buttons hanging below them, and that's it. No climate control screen like in some cars, no multitude of dials or buttons or settings. It's all kind of confined to this one little area, pretty minimalistic and simple. And minimalism also makes an appearance with the seats. This car has some cool looking sport seats, but they're not especially insane tight buckets like you might have in a GT3 RS, and yet they are still manually operated. You have to pull a lever in the front of the seats and then throw your weight forward or backward to move the seats. There are some power functions for these seats, but there are also some manual ones, which I find insane for this car at this price point. Audi would say, well, people ordering sport seats want to save weight. But truthfully, this isn't a GT3 RS or a Ferrari Pista. The R8 is a car people order to drive daily or frequently, and it's strange to see manual operated seats in this car. Now, it is worth pointing out that behind the seats, you do have a surprisingly practical storage area back here. This little carpeted shelf, you can stick stuff back here in case you run out of room in the front trunk, and there's even a little netting area that can keep smaller items in place. So you have some nice storage, which is good to have because the center console doesn't have any storage at all. Instead, you press this little button on the driver's side, pops open the lid and reveals cup holders. Just cup holders, not an actual storage bin. And it's one of the strangest cup holder designs ever because you have this lid that always kind of wants to close directly on top of the cup holders. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but those are your cup holders in the R8. But on the subject of storage in the center console, there is one storage compartment that you won't find on most cars, and it is rather quirky, and that would be this one here, which is a slot for the key. You get in the car and you don't want to have the key in your pocket or whatever, you can stick it here, it fits snugly, and it will stay there until you are ready to get out and you can grab it again. A little key pocket in your center console. Also, another notable storage item in here is at the very front of the center console area, you have another panel that opens up. This one, you push it back and there's a wireless cell phone charger in there, and also a couple of ports, USB ports to plug in your device so it can play with the car's infotainment system. So that's your other storage panel in the center. Other notable button in the center is this one here, which raises or lowers the rear spoiler. Just in case you want to be one of those posers who drives around with the spoiler up at 4 miles an hour, flexing to everybody in South Beach in Miami, that's the button you press. And when you see that spoiler raised at low speeds, you can know the person has raised it in hopes that you will look at them. Now, in terms of controls in this car, the other notable button in this interior is this one over on the door panel for your front trunk. You push that and then the front trunk pops open and gives you access to your front storage compartment. So let's talk about that front storage compartment in the R8, which has a few notable items worth pointing out, including the fact that when you open the front trunk in an R8, you're basically opening the entire front end. The whole thing comes up, including the front fenders. It's all one big piece. The only thing you're not lifting up is the front bumper, which stays put. You lift up this giant front panel and get access to your front cargo compartment. And as for this cargo compartment, you can see it's actually surprisingly large. It's got a decent amount of space for a lot of stuff, for bags, for a nice weekend trip. It does have some good storage space, making this a relatively practical car. You'll also see a few areas that are netted off from the rest of the storage compartment for smaller items. If you don't want them rolling around or colliding with whatever you have in the middle, you can separate those into the smaller compartments. It's all pretty practical and reasonable. You will also notice in this storage compartment that there's a little case in here that says R8, a little zippered case with an R8 logo on it. So what exactly is going on there? Well, you pull this case out, open it up, and it turns out to be a toolkit for spare tire fixing or for making minor roadside repairs. You get like a wrench, a screwdriver, a few other minor tools in here that could potentially be useful in case a R8 owner, $200,000 car, wants to do some roadside fixes while they're driving along. But anyway, since I'm on the outside of this car, I want to discuss a few other notable items out here. For one thing, the turn signals. Front turn signals blink like normal. They're not all that unusual, but the rear turn signals do have a sweeping component like most modern Audis. The top part blinks, the bottom part sweeps across, which looks very cool. Also on the side, you can see the side blade here, which is an Audi R8 hallmark. work. The original R8 had a side blade as one continuous piece, going from basically the top of the car all the way to the bottom. But that was a controversial design element. People thought one big panel there looked a little strange, so for the second generation model, which came out in 17, they switched it to two side blades, one directly behind the windows and the other forming this air intake behind the front door. But you still have a fairly distinctive R8 side blade on the side of the car, which in this case is finished in carbon fiber. By the way, on the subject of the side blades, one cool thing over on the passenger side, the fuel door is integrated into the side blades. You can see it here, aluminum with the R8 logo on it. Rather than try to hide the fuel door, they made it look kind of cool, sticking it right in the center of that side blade and giving it a neat aluminum look with that logo. It's a rather cool looking fuel door, which most cars don't have. Now, the other notable thing to point out on the outside of this car is it looks great. It's still beautiful, it's still gorgeous, attractive. The R8 has always been a nice looking car, and the latest version is still gorgeous, just like it always has been. And it's also restrained, which I think is one of this car's main benefits. This has the same engine as the Lamborghini Huracan, but people choose the R8, I strongly suspect, because they don't want to deal with being a Lambo guy, having that flashy, showy car, the brand name. They want the same performance and excitement in sort of a more restrained, more subtle package, and that's what the R8 provides, and that's what it's provided ever since it was new. It's an attractive, beautiful car that doesn't have all of the supercar baggage that some of its rivals do. But with that said, I think one drawback to the R8, the second gen model, which came out in 17 and has been updated over the years, including for 22, this version, one drawback is it just doesn't look that different from the original R8. The R8 came out back in like 2008, and back then it was incredibly far ahead of its time. It was a design leader, a beautiful car, futuristic, cool, exciting, head-turning, and frankly, Audi hasn't had to evolve it all that much to make it stay current and modern. Frankly, the car has just looked good, and they haven't had to do much to it. But I think that's also been a drawback for this car, because a brand new $200,000 R8 still looks like a 15-year-old R8 you can get for $60,000 or $70,000 or $80,000 used. And I think that's contributed to some of the sales decline in R8 models. When this first came out, they were easily selling 800, 900, 1,000 units per year. But since the second gen came out in 17, it's been more like 600, 500, around there. Some years 700. Doesn't sound like a huge drop, but we're talking 30% in some cases. It's a big decline. I think the fact that this car isn't as hot and exciting and new as it was back in 08 and still has sort of a similar design is part of the reason for that drop. But fairly soon, Audi will replace the R8 with a new electric model. They haven't shown it yet. It's probably still a couple years away, but it's coming, and it's going to totally transform this car, given that the current one has this old school V10. And that will be a complete direction change for the R8 that will send this car into a totally different realm, far from the naturally aspirated V10. And so those are the quirks and features of the 2022 Audi R8. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the 22 R8 rear-wheel drive. It sounds so good. Now, I did an exhaust rev for you before, but for some annoying reason, Audis are limited to 3,000 RPM when they are revving in park. And so, obviously, the annoying reason is to protect the powertrain from damage, but the drawback is that on YouTube, you can't hear the good sounds. You have to hear it when it's actually moving, like this car. Boy, does it move. Oh, that's a sound. That is an amazing, amazing sound that this car delivers. But it's not just the sound. Obviously, this car is also an amazing, amazing performer. And that is something that is just sort of a reality about it. It's got a big V10, it's got a massive amount of power. It's just a supercar. But a lot of people don't think of the R8 that way, even though it shares a powertrain with a Huracan, which is unquestionably a supercar. You know, the R8 has more of kind of a daily driver type feel to it, and I think that's one of the coolest things about this car. It is almost like a 911 Turbo or 911 Turbo S in that respect. You can have like the supercar thrills without having some of the drawbacks, including all the attention, all the impracticality. This car is pretty cool in that regard. But when you do want to go fast, you can go fast. The V10 is tremendously powerful. NA V10. It's amazing to drive a naturally aspirated big powertrain. It's been a long time since I have in a new car, and one of the things you remember is just how much full power delivery it has. Low speeds, high speeds, engine speeds, doesn't really matter. It's just kind of always there as long as you're in the right gear. Ready for big power delivery. This is a really fantastic performer and an exceptional powertrain. Now, I will say one of the things I noticed almost right away about the R8 compared to the Huracan, the R8 steering is just not quite as immediate. It is still excellent, it is fantastic, but the Huracan has some of the most precise steering I've ever been in any car. Also, same true with the 488, Pista, the 488, and mostly with the F8 as well. Those cars are on a different level of steering and handling than this one. I don't want to say something bad about this car because I don't feel that it's like a disappointment or a drawback or whatever. It's just not quite on that level. Now, it's nowhere near those cars in terms of price. This starts at $150. A 4.8 or an F8 starts at like $290, something ridiculous. So you can give up a little steering feel for half the money, but it definitely does give up a little steering feel to the true supercar claim. But what you get back is also important. You have a practical, reasonable car. You have a vehicle that not everybody really looks twice at, unless it's bright yellow like this one. There's a lot to love about the R8 and about what it offers, which really is like supercar thrills and daily driving capability if you want to somehow do that. And the technology in here is decent. Now, I'm not going to say it's amazing tech, and this car does have a little bit of old feeling to it. For example, it has cruise control, but that's it. No adaptive cruise in this car, which for a luxury sports car, you would want adaptive cruise. Porsches have it, this doesn't. Also, USB-A, no USB-C, no center screen. There's some few drawbacks here and there in terms of tech, but the performance makes up for it, I think. Now, one thing I loved about the R8 when it very first came out back in 08-09 is it was relatively affordable. Back then it was like $100,000 to start, and you could get a 911 or an R8. The R8 was way more exotic, and that was a big choice that people had. Now the R8 has gotten pretty expensive. You know, this one starts at $150, but I think most of these will be spec'd to the $170, $180 range, and that's with rear-wheel drive. You go for all-wheel drive, you're easily $210, $220, $230. That's a lot of money, and that's one of the reasons I think why R8 sales have slowed down a little bit. But it's an amazing car. You know, Audi had to do this with Lamborghini to really make the economies of scale work, and so this was always going to be kind of a Huracan, priced not like one, but not as well as it used to be. And so you get more supercar, as that's the benefit. The drawback is price, but the benefit is more supercar. I think that this car is going to go down as a pretty special car, actually. The R8 has fallen out of favor a little bit since it first came out. Other supercars are around, there's more competition, not as many people pay attention to this car, but when they go all electric, I think people are going to look back at the last gasp of the V10 R8 as a thing to have, just like the end of the line for the V10 M5 for Vipers. I think this car will sort of take a similar role. Overall, my opinion on this R8 is it is damn good. It's fast, it sounds good, it's amazing, but most importantly, as supercars go, it's kind of a bargain. Even compared to the new Maserati MC20, this is kind of a deal in some respects, especially at a starting price point of only $150. It's ultimately a really great package. Still incredible, still exciting, fun, fast. It's a great car.
And so that's the updated 2022 Audi R8. This is a cool car with attractive styling and some great performance and a big price tag, but it's especially cool because of its V10. The next generation R8 is going fully electric, but for now you can still get that V10 power, which I suspect this car will be known for long term. Anyway, now it's time to give the 22 R8 a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 68 out of 100, which places the R8 here against other supercar rivals. The R8 falls a bit short of class leaders like the Maserati MC20, McLaren 720S, Ferrari F8, and Lamborghini Huracan, but that's no surprise. The R8 is a bit down on power to those, but it's also less expensive too. The R8 is more aimed at people who want a supercar they can drive every day without the flash of a Lamborghini or a McLaren, and it succeeds at that reasonably well. And although it's getting old, it's still desirable because it won't be long before you can't buy a naturally aspirated V10 powered supercar anymore.